Hey there, Bible 10. All right, here's what we got going on for today, March 25th. As always, hopefully you did your warm up just to get the class started right at the beginning. If you haven't, go ahead and go do that right now. In class today, you'll notice that if you go through the lesson plan in the announcement section on Canvas, there are four main assignments that you're doing. The first thing is doing that warm up about Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. If theoretically by now you've read this thing quite a bit. But for Matthew chapter 5, his Sermon on the Mount, I want you to think, in your opinion, as you read through it, what's the best part to you? What's the most confusing part to you? And what's maybe the most shocking or offensive part to you? As we've talked about many times, Jesus was really good at offending the status quo, the people who were in charge, the people who allegedly knew how to live life. So, in your opinion, what's like the most offensive part of Matthew chapter 5? After that, be watching this video, which is what you're doing right now. And then there's three assignments for class today. The first is to interview Jesus, meaning open up that Matthew chapter 5 note that you did from Monday, the one that you annotated and did that catch reading for. And you're going to write out some questions that you have for Jesus. After reading through his Sermon on the Mount, at least that first chapter, there should be some spaces where you're like, Jesus, what do you mean here? Or Jesus, how am I supposed to do this? Or why are you so harsh here? Or is there another way we could do this? Or tell me how I'm supposed to live, like that kind of thing. What are some questions related to the text? You're going to just draw those in the margins and draw arrows to what you're referring to in your questions. After that, I'm going to walk you through the graphic organizer, and you can add to your note and then resubmit. And then last, you have an exit ticket, which is what if everybody obeyed Jesus, which I'll explain once we're in the PowerPoint. So let's go ahead and dive into our work for today. So as I already mentioned, you should have done that warm-up about Jesus' sermon already. And then after that warm-up, the interview Jesus thing. Now, I think in the assignment description, I said that you need to have at least 5 questions for Jesus. If after reading Matthew chapter 5, you don't have at least 5 questions that you would want to ask Jesus, you probably haven't read it well. So go through it and read it one last time. Maybe use, like I said last time, you can use the NIV version on the YouVersion app and hit the play button, and it'll automatically play for you. You'll have that guy with that velvety British voice reading to you. And then after that, ask some questions of Jesus. Be thinking, okay, if I was listening to Jesus' sermon the very first time, what are some things that I would want to clarify or ask for guidance on? Once you've done that, go ahead and open up that Notability note that you did last time, that heart graphic organizer, and we're going to start working through this together. You guys already did a little bit of thought about what each of these things meant and what is the internal condition of your heart. But I wanted to kind of unpack the ideas a little bit more just to give you a chance to kind of get what's going on inside of Jesus. So let's see. What is happening here? Nope. For some reason, it doesn't want to. I don't want to buy a version. How do I get out of this? I don't know what I hit a second ago. Deny. That's not what I want. I might have to reconnect. Hold. All right, hopefully that fixed it. So if you have this Notability note back open, we are going to go ahead and continue working through what Jesus is really after. Last time we were together, we even talked about in the PowerPoint how the righteousness of the Pharisees is all about seeing where that line is. Is it a sin to do this? Is it wrong if I do that? How do I make sure that I'm doing this right or wrong? We talked about how the problem with that is that, like, when we draw a line, the human tendency is to want to get to as close to that line as possible without crossing it over. And so Jesus says, no, we've got it all wrong, right? We've totally missed the point if we're asking, is it a sin to do this or is it a sin to do that? But rather, he says, hey, let's go ahead and redefine what these things are all about. And so, the first one we want to talk about is Jesus says, "You've heard it said, do not commit murder." And actually, I probably should pull up this biblical text, because if we don't have this biblical text up, then it's going to be really hard to look at this together. So let's start with Matthew chapter 5. He says, "You have heard it said, that it was said to people of old, 'You shall not murder, and whoever murders will be liable to judgment.' But I say to you that everyone who's angry with his brother will be liable to judgment. Whoever insults his brother will be liable to the council, and whoever says, 'You fool,' will be liable to the hell of fire." And then he goes on to say why we need to fix things with people right away. With that being said, why would Jesus commit like saying not to commit murder is linked to, for example, being angry with someone and maybe calling names? One of the names he says is to call someone Raka. Is the ancient way of saying empty-headed, right? You dummy. So why would Jesus say, okay, murder and calling people names and being angry with people are linked together? If you think about it, like, think for a second, what does it take to be able to murder someone? Oftentimes, when people think about murder, like usually the default responses are like, okay, people are angry or they're mad at people, and so maybe that's why murder happens. Which I guess, yeah, that's true, and it might make sense that that's why Jesus connects these two. But not everybody murders because of anger, right? There's other reasons that people kill each other. So Jesus connects these two things because if you're ever going to murder someone, what it means is that you don't value their life, right? That you don't think that their life is important. And so, or at least not more important than whatever your reasons are for killing them. And so in the same way, Jesus says, hey, guess what else comes from that region of your heart? The region of your heart where murder is made possible. The thing that comes out of that region of your heart is calling someone an idiot or a fool or a dummy. Because when we make fun of people, when we bully people, when we rage at people, they no longer are people who have intrinsic value that are important, right? But then they're just objects of wrath or objects for the sake of us to be able to tease them or make fun of them or poke fun at them. And so in this region of the heart, the thing that Jesus wants for us is he wants us to value people. If we don't value people, it makes sense why murder happens sometimes. But then at the same time, if we don't value people, it makes sense why sometimes we call people names and don't care about their feelings. And so if this region of our heart values people and knows that people are made in God's image, then what ends up happening is like things like murder are not even possible anymore if we value people. You get how that works? So Jesus is saying, you've heard it said, don't commit murder. That's great. You followed some laws, but let me tell you what's going on the inside, which is why he goes with anger and why he goes with calling people names. And he says, if you have problems with people, I don't know if you've ever been in a conflict with someone and then you decided, well, they're not worth it to try to work this out. But like, that's like at the center of this is the whole valuing people thing. If you value them, then you're going to want to work it out before you have to go to court. You're going to want to have to make things better before it escalates and turns into a fight. So the region of your heart that values people is going to allow you to obey both do not commit murder and these things that Jesus adds on to it. Then after that, Jesus says, you have heard it said to the people long ago, you shall not commit adultery. Now, for those of you who maybe English is your second language or you don't use this kind of vocabulary, adultery means to cheat on a spouse, to be with someone else, like in a physical sense. So you've heard it said, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. For it's better to lose one of your members than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. For it's better that you lose one of your members than for your whole body to go into hell. So Jesus, he's talking about this thing that was this external command of not committing adultery. but that not committing adultery is this thing that people do outside in the external world. So Jesus, again, if we're looking at the internal condition of your heart, he says, no, don't even lust after someone with intent. Now, it's really important to explain that lust is not the same as attraction. I think that sometimes people think that, like, oh, if you're attracted to someone, that means you're lusting. However, it's a little bit different than that. Lust, like the ESV, the way that it explains it is because it says, those of you who lust with intent. Lust is the conscious act to think about another person and desire someone even if they are not yours, to like turn them into an object that you desire, or like to long for or want to own and possess someone or something that is not yours. And so lust isn't, I mean, this is why even sometimes, like, poetically, people use the word lust to describe things other than like romantic interests, because sometimes people desire things that are not theirs. And so Jesus' solution to this is to say, yeah, adultery wouldn't happen if people didn't lust, right? And the part of your heart that lusts, the part of your heart that desires something that is not yours, this could all be remedied if this part of your heart was content, right? If you were content, be content with what, and if you are married, or who you have. Because here's the thing, if you were content, then you wouldn't desire others. And if if you're content and not desiring others, then naturally adultery will not happen. So Jesus says that region of your heart, you need to make sure that that is clean. That part of your heart, making sure that you are not lusting, will automatically cancel out adultery. Adultery will not happen if you work on the condition of your heart to be a content human being with what or whoever you are with. And notice that in this one, Jesus uses some pretty drastic vocabulary. He says if your eye causes you to sin, you need to pluck it out. If your hand causes you to sin, you need to cut it off. And I think it was in third period that we talked about how, like, wait, can he possibly be literal? And I think before we jump to conclusions, let's not get, I think sometimes when we hear things like that, we're like, okay, let's throw it out. But like, let's take him seriously. Okay, what if he does mean to literally do that? If your problem is lust and you pluck out your eyeball, do you think that will completely solve the issue of lust? Like, think about it. Even if you didn't have your eye, you would still be able to lust. Even if you didn't have a hand, I'm sure that you would still be able to commit the same sin that you desired, even without a hand. And so I think what Jesus is saying is, yes, literally cut things out of your life. However, I think he gives these two things as examples because we all know that removal of a hand or removal of an eye will not actually solve things. And so if lust is your issue, then maybe it means being willing to take extreme measures to cut things out of your life so that you can learn to have your heart look like what Jesus is talking about here, where you're content and not lusting after things that are not yours. So maybe this means deleting an app from your phone. Maybe this means like not going to clubs if you go to clubs. Maybe it means changing your recreational activities because you know that when you're in that circumstance, that's where your mind goes. And so Jesus's command to like cut off a hand or pluck out an eye, I don't think it means that we necessarily need to like remove body parts, but with that same amount of like commitment and seriousness, remove things in our lives that potentially contaminate that area of our hearts. So we need to value people, because if we do that, then we don't murder or call people names. We need to be content with what we have, because if we do that, then we don't commit adultery anymore. And then the next one we talked about last time we were together is about divorce, whereas like the Mosaic Code said, make sure that you divorce properly. And Jesus says, instead of thinking about making sure you do it right, like how about we just hold to our commitments like we originally talked about. And so that's what's going on there. And so I'm not even going to recover this because we talked about this last week. Keeping oaths to God. He says, you have heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not swear falsely, but shall perform to the Lord what you have sworn. But I say to you, don't take an oath at all, either by heaven, for it's the throne of God, or by the earth, for it's his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it's the city of the great king. And do not take an oath by your head, for you cannot make one hair white or black. Let what you say be simply yes or no. Anything more than this comes from evil. And so he says, hey, before the important thing was making sure that you keep your oaths. But now I say, don't have to tell an oath. Don't have to make a promise. Don't have to swear. Think about it. If you have to say, dude, I totally promise, or I swear to God, or I swear on my grandmother's grave, or whatever you have to say to make people believe you, what does that say about your character? If you have to make those types of promises, if you have to say those types of things for people to believe you, it means that maybe you're not super trustworthy in the first place. Jesus isn't saying, okay, it's a sin if you take an oath, right? Because that's usually what people will ask here is like, okay, well, what's the, so he says, don't take oaths at all. So that means it's a sin to take an oath. And like, no, if you go to court and you have to take an oath to say that you're going to tell the truth, that's fine. You're not sinning. But I think what he's driving at is, again, if we look at the internal condition of people's hearts, then the region of your heart that needs to take oaths, if you are just an honest person, if you be honest, then what ends up happening is, guess what? You don't need to take oaths anymore. And of course, if you ever did take an oath, then that region of your heart is already clean, and you would fulfill it because you're going to be honest. You're not going to commit. You're not going to commit to doing things that you can't promise to follow through on. So your yes will simply be yes. Your no would simply be no. You wouldn't have to promise or unpromise things. You wouldn't have to swear. You wouldn't need to take oaths. So again, if we have this if we have this region of our heart all clean and honest, then we wouldn't have to worry about keeping oaths to God. Next, we have Jesus talking about vengeance, which this is where it gets a little bit trickier. So the groups who had this passage, the notes, for some reason they didn't post to PowerPoint when I exported them as PDFs, but I think it was Desmond's group did a really good job of like unpacking these different things. So the three offenses that the vengeance passage talks about is if you're slapped, if you have your cloak taken, and walking a mile with someone's bag. And so let's look at that passage where it says, "You've heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, but I say to you, do not resist the one who is evil. But if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. And if anyone would sue you and take your tunic, let him have your cloak as well. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles. Give to the one who begs from you, and do not refuse the one who would borrow from you." And the heading the ESV gives is that this is talking about retaliation, which is another way of saying vengeance. And I think I'm not sure how this is going to work with this, like this, the way the camera might mirror things, but this is my right cheek. And Jesus says, if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other. So if someone was going to slap me on the right cheek, I need you to like imagine that I'm sitting right in front of you and you slap me on the right cheek. Imagine you're going to slap me with your right hand. The only way that you could slap me with your right hand to hit my right cheek is you would have to backhand me, right? Like if you backhand me, that's how you slap my right cheek. And Jesus says to turn to them the other. So if you're going to slap me on the other cheek, which is my left cheek, you would have to open hand slap me. Now, the reason this is important is because in ancient societies, the backhanded slap was something that you would do to someone who is less than you in society. Whereas the forehanded slap would be something that you would do to people who like are equals to you. Like almost imagine like starting a duel with someone, you forehanded slap that person. Whereas if they are your slave or they're your servant, or even like in ancient society, it was okay to hit kids. Like if you're hitting a kid, you backhand slap them. And Jesus says, don't just the normal options that people have is if you get slapped on the right cheek, people have two responses. One is to hit them back, right? And fight back. And the other response is just to accept it and be like, okay, I'm your servant or slave. I deserve that. And Jesus says, no, 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 no. If people do that, turn them the other cheek. Because in offering them the left cheek, you then give them a really uncomfortable choice. Either they have to choose and say, you're right, I don't need to hit you. I shouldn't hit you again, and then refuse to hit you. Or if they do hit you, then they end up hitting you as equals. So you put them in this sort of like trap where if they do hit you, they say that you're equals with them, or if they don't hit you, they show that they've like learned that they need to not hit you anymore. So it's not about getting vengeance, right? It's not and it's not about like laying down on the ground and being a doormat. It's about this creative way of responding that forces evil to confront its own injustice. He says, you've heard it said that like if someone sues you for your cloak, give them your tunic also. Your outer cloak, especially for poor people in that society, your outer cloak was like your blanket at night that you would use to sleep. So he says, if someone is suing you for your cloak, like think about how greedy they have to be. So you know what, if they're going to do that, give them your shirt also. Or if someone sues you for your shirt, give them your cloak also, because then you're going to be naked. And then everyone's going to say, dude, why is this guy naked? And the answer is going to be because that guy over there is greedy. Right? And so Jesus again comes up with a creative way. Instead of fighting against the guy who wants to sue you for your cloak or suing him back, he says, come up with a creative way that puts on evil on display and makes evil have to rethink why it would do the messed up things. The walking a mile chunk is like for Roman soldiers, they could force a person to carry their bag for 1 mile. So imagine, but like they were also like not available, like, or they weren't able to like force people to carry it for more than 1 mile. So imagine a Roman soldier says, you carry my bag, and you carry his bag. And as you're going along the path, you hit mile 1 and the Roman soldier says, okay, please give me my bag back. And then you say, no, don't worry about it. I'll go an extra mile. So now the Roman soldier is like I guess, going to be worried, like, oh no, I'm going to get in trouble. And so imagine the scene of a Roman soldier begging a poor Jewish peasant, like, please give me my backpack back so that I can carry it. Right? Like it's these like creative ways that confront injustice and evil and force it to take a third way. Like there are certain Christian traditions that talk about Jesus's third way, because the one way is like being passive and not doing anything and receiving the evil. The other way is being violent and fighting back. And Jesus says, no, 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 there's a third way that's neither of those, but it's creative. It's creative and it's restorative. Because all three of these options, the responding with the slap and the cloak and the walking an extra mile, all of these force evil to confront their evil. And so this part of your heart, he says, be creative, right? If we are creative and restorative, if we're creative and restorative in our heart, then I think we find ourselves doing these types of creative things. It's not just about like, okay, how do I get along in life? But this evil person who's attacking me, how do I help them confront the evil that's in their hearts? But do it in a creative way that's not just about taking out violence back on them. That one was a lot. All right, and now there's one more. The last one is to love your friends. And so this last passage, he says, you have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who's in heaven. For he makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the just and the unjust. For if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? If you greet only your brothers, what more are you doing than others? Do not even the Gentiles do the same? You therefore must be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. Now, a question that students always have is like, wait, we have to be perfect? I thought that that's impossible. What Jesus says, like, first of all, Jesus is probably preaching in Aramaic, and in Aramaic there isn't really a word for perfect. He's probably saying good, like be good like your father is. And what the father's goodness looks like is causing the sun to rise on the evil and on the good. Being perfect or being good like your father means loving everybody, which is what gets into this last region of our hearts. Because it seems like love, wait, isn't this an inside thing? Like all of these, yeah, I get like vengeance, that's an outside. Divorce, that's an outside thing. Oaths are outside. Adultery, murder, all these things are external commands. But loving, isn't this like an internal thing that happens in your heart? But notice what Jesus does here is he says, it's not just about loving your friends, it's about loving everybody, your friends and your enemies. So, like, notice that, like, what Jesus says is, he says, you shall love but I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Literally, I dare you, read through the Gospels. The only person that Jesus says to pray for, like when it comes to praying for someone, the only person Jesus says to pray for is your enemies. So what Jesus is doing here is he's saying, normally, who is loved and who is unloved is determined outside of you. Normally it's determined by, like, if that person likes you or not, if that person is part of your circle, if that person in the external world treats you a certain way, and then that determines what goes on inside of your heart, whether you love them or not. But this is not what Jesus wants you to do. What Jesus says is, instead, I need you to love people if they're your friends, love them if they're your enemies. They get to choose if they're your friend or your enemy. They get to choose if they're on your side or against you, if they want to fight you, if they want to love you and hug you. Either way, they get to choose. But you know what you're going to do? You're going to love. Period. Or I guess if we're going to say it's character, you're going to be loving. Because if you're a loving person, if that person hates you, you're going to love them. If that person loves you, you're going to love them. If they want to be your friend, you're going to love them. If they want to punch you in the face, you're going to love them. Because if you change the condition of your heart to being a loving person, then, of course, you'll both love your friends and you'll love your enemies. So this is what Jesus is after. He's about revolutionizing the internal condition of your hearts so that you no longer have to ask the question, is it a sin? You don't have to ask if it's a sin to murder if you deeply value people. You don't have to ask if it's a sin to commit adultery if you're content with what you have in life. You don't have to ask a sin if it's a sin if you like break your oaths because you're going to be an honest person. See, all of these things, if we transform the internal reality for creative, restorative, loving people, then we don't have to ask questions about vengeance or who to love or what type of divorce we should have. Jesus says we need to go beyond the righteousness of the Pharisees. So this is his point. You go beyond the righteousness of the Pharisees by totally eliminating these external categories and instead focusing on what's going on inside your heart, changing the type of person that you are. Does that make sense? You can't respond to me, so I'm going to hope so. So here's what you're going to do. Those notes that you just took as you followed along with me, you're going to resubmit those to the Sermon on the Mount graphic organizer, round 2. And then here's your exit ticket. I want you to think about one of these things that we just went through: murder, adultery, oaths, divorce, vengeance, love. And think about that internal condition of the heart. And I want you to imagine that everybody in the world did that one thing. So if it's murder, imagine everybody in the world valued people. Now, imagine everyone in the world was content with their place and the people in their lives. Imagine everyone was honest. Imagine everybody held to their commitments. Imagine everybody was creative and restorative. Or imagine everybody just loved everybody. Choose one of those things, and I want you to imagine what would the world look like if everybody put that one thing into practice. So that's your exit ticket. Make sure you write. Don't just be like, the world would be better. Like, explain. What would the internet look like? What would families look like? What would businesses look like if everybody put this stuff into practice. Once you've done that exit ticket, you are dismissed. I'll be hanging out in my Zoom classroom as always, the last 10 to 15 minutes of class, just in case you had any additional questions. Hope you guys have a wonderful Wednesday. Don't forget that we have a scripture quiz on Matthew chapter 6. We're going to move into the next chapter on Friday. See you later, guys. You are dismissed.